Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to create our own web browser by adding browser history. This was our application at the end of the last video. As we have done in previous videos, the first part of this video will cover fixing bugs or problems that have occurred from the previous video's code. The second part of the video will involve enhancing the application further. Today's enhancement is going to be the addition of browser history. The user can currently access up to 10 tabs on the browser, and I want each of these tabs to have its own history, to allow the user to move backwards and forwards in the history. So firstly, let's have a look at the bug we've discovered in the application. If we open up two additional tabs, so that we have 3 tabs on the browser, and we drag in one of the pages. And we'll drag in page 2, and to the final tab, we'll drag in page 1. So we now have 3 tabs, each populated with a different web page. If we go to demo page 2, the middle tab, and if we right click and close the tab, this should leave demo page 3 and the first demo page enabled, which it appears to do. However, if we click on demo page, it's showing page 2. So it has not correctly deleted page 2. And we've lost page 1. So that's a bug we'll need to fix in today's work. But before we get into the code, let's have a look at how we're going to design this browser history. Now, in order to design this history, we need to look at our tabs. We have in total 10 tabs that the user can actually use, from tab 1 to tab number 10. There is an 11th tab, but that's purely for adding additional pages. So while we have 10 tabs, we will need to keep a separate history for each tab, from tab 1 all the way to tab 10. So how many histories do we want to keep? Let's start with a list of 10 histories per tab. So each tab will maintain a historical list of the 10 last pages visited by the user. So the user can put in a number of pages and then use the forward and back buttons to go back and forward in that history. If they have only put in 3 pages, then they can go no further forward than the 3rd page, but they can go all the way back to the 1st. So this list will be kept separately for each of the tabs. So having 10 tabs and 10 histories, we will keep a total of 100 URLs in our history log. So let's now have a look at the code to see how we can implement this design. In an application, the current bug involves the deletion of a tab. This is handled in its own form. So if we have a look at the callback function for the dialog which handles the tab click, this is where the tab is actually deleted. And while the tab is actually being deleted, the problem occurs when we try to click on another tab. The wrong details are being shown. This is because we're not removing the information from one of the arrays. We have a number of arrays within the application which are global, and we're going to be adding to those arrays today. The issue revolves around the global array which is holding the URL for each of the tabs. As we've deleted the tab, we need to delete the entry in the URL global array. As we're going to be creating a history for all of the tabs, we're going to wrap this up in a common function to remove tab history, and we'll be calling it in this section here in the W in command section when the close tab button is clicked. So we're going to create a new function called remove tab history whose task in life it will be to remove the tab history and cure this issue. So here is the skeleton of our new remove tab history function, taking its single parameter, which is the tab which has been selected by the user for deletion. So our first task is to delete the current URL from the global array. We can do that using the array delete command. The array delete command will remove that entry in the array and shuffle all the other entries up one to fill the gap. And the last entry in the array will be a zero-length string, which is ideal. If we try rerunning our application now, and dragging in pages, and we will create 2 additional pages, and we will drag in a page 2 and a page 1. So we have a page 3, a page 2, and a page 1. If we delete page 2 and go back to page 1, we are now correctly holding the values for page 3 and page 1, and page 2 is now nowhere in sight. So we've cured that single bug. So now we can push on and add the code to our application to allow it to do browser histories. So once more, back to the code. So as I said earlier, we're going to be adding some more global arrays. This is to keep track of the URL's history for each of the tabs. So there are our 2 new global arrays, one called URL history and one called latest slot. The URL history, as you can probably guess, is to maintain a history for all of the tabs. The second one, called latest slot, is an array to hold the latest slot number for each tab. That way, if there are only 3 entries, the value for the tab will be 3, as it's the latest entry. So let's now dimension these in our PB main function. So there are our new arrays. The URL history array is a 2-dimensional array, comprising the maximum number of tabs and a new constant called maximum history. And the latest slot is a single-dimension array for the maximum number of tabs. So the maximum amount of history we're going to do for this particular browser is 10. So a user will in theory be able to go back 10 pages in any tab. So we will create a new constant at the top called max history and set a value of 10. Storing these as constants means that should you require to increase these numbers, it's very easy to do at the beginning of your code. So as we have 2 browser buttons on the dialog, one to allow it to go back a page and one to go forward, we need to know what the current slot number is for each of the tabs. So let's have a look at the callback function of our main dialog. So we've created a new local variable called current slot. This is the currently selected history slot on the tab currently selected. So first we will handle when the user drops a file onto the browser. So if we look at the drop files event, so after we have populated the global array for URLs, we're going to increment the latest slot value based on the page number selected by the user. And we'll also store the new URL as the latest web page for this tab. And we're going to do that by creating a brand new function. And that new function we're going to call store URL history, taking 2 parameters, the page or tab number and the URL string. So let's first create this new function. So here is the skeleton of our new function taking its 2 parameters. And in this function, we're going to pick up the current slot by looking at the global array for latest slot and passing it the page number. This will give us the current slot for this particular tab. We're then using that value and feeding it in to our global array for the URL history, using the 2 parameters of the page number and the current slot number. And we're making that equal to the URL which the user has dropped on the graphics control. And since the user has dropped this in, I've checked with other browsers. When a user actually loads one of these pages in, anything above this in the history is blanked out. So we've got a small for next loop to look from the current slot +1 to the end of the history, and making everything after that blank. And at the end of this function, we need to reset the back or forward buttons. Currently in our code, the back and forward buttons are automatically disabled, but these buttons will have to be enabled based on the information the browser holds. If the user is on the very most recent web page of this particular tab, then the forward button will be disabled, and the back button will be enabled. And if the user is going backwards in the history, then once they get to the first entry for this particular tab, then the back button will be disabled and the forward button will be enabled if there are additional pages the user can view. So that's another new function we're going to have to create to set the back and forward buttons. So the logic within this function is going to be quite straightforward. If the URL history pointed to +1 is equal to an empty len string, then the next slot is blank and we can turn off the forward button. Otherwise, we enable the forward button using the control, disable and enable commands. If the current slot is slot number 1, then there's only one slot, so at that point we can turn off the back button. Otherwise, we enable the back button. So that's the logic for the backward and forward buttons. In order to determine whether our code's going to be working correctly or not, we need to put some debug code in here. One of the things that you can do with the PowerBasic for Windows is to use the text control. This will display a text window which you can send information to. And this can be turned off later once the program goes into production. So we're going to create a new function called display history. This function will take a single parameter, which is the page number we're on, the current tab. And within this function, I'm creating a static variable called win. This will be the Windows handle of this control. If the window is 0, then we're using a text window command to open a brand new text debug box. And we're calling that URL history. Otherwise, we're clearing the value out within that text box. And then we're printing out the tab number. And then we're doing a loop to print out all the history for that particular tab coming from the global array. So all we need to do now is find some way of actually triggering the call to this function so we can display the history. So we're going to go back to the event handler, the callback function for the main dialog. In here we have events for the back button, the forward button and the home button. We're not currently using the home button and won't be populating it within this video. So we're going to put our code in the event for this button. This is purely for debug purposes. And there is the call for display history. We're first getting the tab that's been selected, putting that into the page number, which passes as a parameter to our new function. So at any point we can press that home button and get a message displayed on screen to show us what the history of each of the tabs is. If we try running the application now and click on the home page, we get a debug coming up giving us a list of all the history for this particular tab. At the moment it has no history. So the debug code is working fine. So let's go back to the code and add in a few more functions. If the user actually deletes one of the tabs, then we're going to have to clear the history out for that tab. So we'll need a clear history for tab function. And here is that new function. Again, it's nothing particularly special. It takes a single parameter, which is the page or tab number. It then runs through the global array for URL history and erases each entry for that particular page number. It sets the current slot number in the latest slot array to 0, and we're now disabling the back and forward buttons. As I mentioned earlier, we're also going to make an addition to that new function we added to remove tab history. Since we've added new arrays, we're going to have to handle purging those as well. So first we're doing an array delete on the latest slot array. removing the current tab selected. And then we're going to do a nested for next loop, from the tab selected to the end of the tabs, and from 1 to the max history. This is used to copy down values in the URL history array so that all the entries for the tabs above are actually copied down by one tab. And then the very last entry is to purge the last tab to ensure that it is indeed blank. So one other small change I want to make to the code is in the render the HTML function. Within here, if the program decides that the HTML is not formatted correctly, prints out the words invalid HTML formatting. It also prints all of the HTML to that control. So I'm going to take that out just in case the user drags something like a JPEG or an exe into the window. We don't want to display all that on the screen. So all of the new functions we've created, one of them is clear history for tab. So we'll need to put this in at one point in the code where the user selects a new tab. If the user clicks on the plus tab, they're adding a brand new tab. So we need to ensure that the data for that tab is cleared out. So let's go to the event handler, the callback function of the main dialog. And this is a section where the tab selection has been changed. So in here, we're going to add a call to our clear history for tab, passing it the tab number, the page number. And this will clear out any data sitting in that array for the user. And if the user picks some other tab, then we need to pick up the current slot based on that. So at the moment, we're picking up the URL from the URLs array. We need to amend that slightly, and we need to reset the forward and back buttons. So now we're picking up the current slot from the latest slot array. We're setting the URL from the URL history. And we're calling a new set back and forward buttons function to set the disable or enable properties on those two buttons. So now we need to put some logic in the back and forward buttons so that when the user decides to click on them, the application will actually do something. So at the moment, there is no code whatsoever except a message box in both of these events. So first of all, to go back a page, we need to pick up the tab handle using the tab get select command. And we can set the current slot for that tab by pulling back from the global array the value held within the latest slot array. We can then decrement that value by 1, and we can pull back from the URL history the value held within that array. If the value that is obtained is not blank, then we can render the page to the graphics control. First, we will set the text box on the dialog for the value of the URL, and then call our common function render the HTML. And then we need to store the current slot number in our latest slot array. And then we can enable the forward button. And this should complete the logic for clicking on the back button. And next we need to do something very similar for the forward button when it becomes clicked. We need to pick up the tab the user has selected. We need to work out the current slot from the latest slot array. We need to increment that value, and then we can get the URL. If the URL is not blank, then again we can render the page, setting the text on the dialog, calling the render the HTML function, and storing the current slot number within the latest slot array, and then setting the back and forward buttons. The only other change we need make is when the user enters a URL in that text box. And then when they press the enter button, it will then call the ID OK event within our callback function, our event handler, which is down here. And what we need to do in here is much the same as we've done further up in the code. We need to increment the slot number, store the URL, and render the page. So here we are advancing the latest slot number within the latest slot array, storing the URL history, and re-rendering the URL to the graphics control. So now that we have that in place, we should have completed all the coding. Now we can do a little bit of testing. So there is our browser, and we'll drag in some of our web pages. I've created a web page 4 to give us more pages to work with. If we drag in page 4, then page 3, then page 2, and then finally page 1. So we should have a history of 4 pages on this tab. And if we click on the little debug button and have a look, we do indeed have 4 entries. The most recent one is page 1, we have page 2, page 3, and page 4. So as you will see, the back button is currently enabled. If we press the back button, it should take us to page 2, and then to page 3, and finally page 4. And on page 4, you cannot go any further, but you can go forward again, page 3, page 2, and page 1 when the button is now disabled. So we have a history for tab number 1. Can we do the same for a second tab? So for the second tab, we'll put the values in the other way round. We'll go for page 1, then page 2, then page 3, and finally page 4. So if we look at the history for tab 2 is showing pages 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the history appears to be working well. So let's add a third and final page. And we'll drag in page number 2. So we can go back and forward for each of the tabs, showing the page it currently has as current. If we then attempt to delete the second tab, it should delete, and page 2 is now showing as the second tab. So that appears to be working well. So in summary, what we've done today is to fix a bug in the previous video's code. Additionally, we have added more global arrays to allow the user to have browser history for each of the 10 tabs, allowing them up to 10 pages in the browser history. There is, of course, a great deal more to do, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.